Counselor, perhaps if you spent less time shopping at thrift stores and more time preparing your cases, your clients wouldn't be such obvious losers. Judge Richard Morrison's voice booms across the courtroom, drawing laughter from the prosecutor's table and scattered chuckles from the gallery. 29-year-old Keisha stands at the defense table in her 4-year-old Navy suit, the only professional outfit she owns that still fits, her hands gripping her notes so hard the paper crinkles. Around her, 200 people watch her public humiliation. Court reporters, law students, journalists covering what everyone assumes will be an open and shut conviction. Your Honor, Keisha keeps her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. My client deserves the same vigorous defense as anyone who can afford a $1,000 suit. The quality of justice shouldn't depend on save the social justice speech for your college campus. Judge Morrison waves his hand dismissively, his expensive gold watch catching the light. This is a court of law. Your client is guilty. Everyone in this room knows it. Let's not waste taxpayers' money pretending otherwise. Keisha looks at her client. Marcus, 19 years old, black, accused of armed robbery he didn't commit. His future hangs on this trial, and the judge has already decided he's guilty before hearing the defense. Your Honor, I have evidence that... Evidence? The judge laughs, a cruel sound that makes several jurors smile. Counselor, I've been on this bench for 23 years. I know a guilty defendant when I see one, and your client, sitting there in his baggy clothes looking exactly like what he is guilty. Now sit down and let's get through this charade so we can all go home. But what Judge Morrison doesn't know about the public defender he's mocking, the woman in the cheap suit he assumes is incompetent, is that she graduated top of her class from Yale Law School. The bargain bin lawyer he's dismissing turned down six-figure offers from corporate firms to defend people who couldn't afford representation. And the closing argument she's about to deliver will not only free her innocent client, but expose 23 years of judicial corruption that will end his career and send him to prison. The judge who laughed at her cheap suit is about to learn that justice doesn't wear designer labels. Orleans Parish Criminal Court, Courtroom 6, New Orleans, Louisiana. A building that's seen decades of justice and injustice in equal measure. High ceilings with peeling paint. Wooden benches worn smooth by countless bodies waiting for their day in court. Fluorescent lights that flicker and hum. The kind of place where poor people's futures get decided in 15-minute hearings. Judge Richard Morrison presides over this courtroom like a king over his domain. 62 years old, silver hair perfectly styled, custom-tailored black robes that probably cost more than most defendants make. In a month, on the bench for 23 years, re-elected 5 times, connected to every powerful person in Louisiana politics. Untouchable. He's the kind of judge defense attorneys dread. The kind who's already decided guilt before hearing evidence. The kind who treats public defenders with open contempt and prosecutors like honored guests. The kind who gives harsh sentences to black defendants and lenient ones to white-collar criminals. But he's careful, smart enough to avoid obvious bias in his rulings, skilled at making his prejudice sound like judicial wisdom. He knows exactly how to humiliate defense attorneys without crossing lines that would get him reversed on appeal. Today's case is State v. Marcus Johnson, armed robbery. The prosecution claims 19-year-old Marcus held up a convenience store with a gun, stole $340, and fled. They have a witness who picked him out of a lineup. Security footage that allegedly shows someone matching his description. And Marcus's prior record, possession of marijuana 2 years ago, which the prosecutor keeps mentioning to paint him as a career criminal. Marcus sits at the defense table wearing the only dress clothes he owns, khakis and a button-down shirt his mother bought from Walmart specifically for this trial. He's terrified. He's never been in a courtroom before except for that marijuana charge, which got him probation. Now he's facing 10 to 20 years in prison for something he didn't do. His lawyer is Keisha Williams, public defender. She's been assigned to his case 3 weeks ago when his previous public defender quit the office. 3 weeks to prepare for a trial that should have taken months. 3 weeks to investigate a case the police and prosecutors have been building for 6 months. Keisha looks young, 29, but could pass for 25. Natural hair pulled back in a professional bun. Minimal makeup because good makeup costs money she doesn't have. The navy suit she's wearing is from her law school graduation 4 years ago. She's lost weight since then, stress and irregular meals, so it doesn't fit quite right anymore. Slightly too loose in the waist, sleeves a bit too long. Shoes from Target, polished as well as cheap pleather can be. She looks exactly like what she is. A public defender drowning in too many cases, paid too little, working with inadequate resources. What she doesn't look like is what she actually is. Keisha graduated from Yale Law School ranked number 2 in her class. Could have been number 1, but she'd spent her 3rd year working with the Innocence Project instead of padding her GPA. Law review editor, published 2 articles on criminal justice reform. Job offers from every major firm in New York, Boston, Chicago. She'd turned them all down and joined the public defender's office in New Orleans, her hometown. Starting salary, $42,000 a year, in a city where rent kept rising and public defender budgets kept shrinking. Her law school classmates thought she was crazy. You could make $190,000 at corporate firms, they'd said. You could pay off your loans in 5 years and then do pro bono work. But Keisha had grown up in New Orleans East, in a neighborhood where everyone knew someone who'd been swept up by the criminal justice system. She'd seen how poor people got ground up by a system that gave them overworked lawyers and predetermined outcomes. She'd watched her own cousin get convicted of a crime he didn't commit because his public defender had 150 other cases and couldn't spend more than 3 hours on his trial. She'd gone to law school specifically to be a public defender, to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves, to be the lawyer she wished her cousin had. The job was exactly as hard as she'd expected. She carried 120 active cases at any given time. She worked 70-hour weeks. She made less than some of her clients made dealing drugs. She lived in a studio apartment with a window AC unit that barely worked and a refrigerator that contained mostly cheap ramen and eggs. But she was good at her job. Brilliant, even. She won cases other public defenders would have pled out. She found evidence police had missed. She cross-examined witnesses until their stories fell apart. In 4 years, she'd taken 37 cases to trial, won 23 of them, got reduced charges on 11 others. Only 3 convictions that she hadn't been able to prevent. Her clients loved her, her colleagues respected her, and judges hated her, because Keisha didn't play the game, didn't smile and nod when judges rushed through hearings, didn't accept bad plea deals to move the docket, didn't treat her indigent clients like they deserved less justice than wealthy defendants. She fought hard, every single time, which is why Judge Morrison had been particularly cruel to her from the moment she'd appeared in his courtroom. The trial had started 3 days ago. Jury selection was a nightmare. The prosecutor used peremptory strikes to remove every black juror except 2. Keisha had objected, citing clear racial bias. Judge Morrison had overruled her with barely concealed irritation. Counselor, the prosecution has valid race-neutral reasons for their strikes. Your accusations of bias are unfounded and frankly offensive. Move on. The resulting jury was 10 white people, 1 black woman, and 1 Latino man, in a city that was majority black, for a black defendant. Opening statements had gone predictably. The prosecutor, Stephen Mitchell, mid-40s, expensive suit, slicked back hair, painted Marcus as a dangerous criminal who'd terrorized an innocent store clerk. He showed the grainy security footage, presented the witness who'd identified Marcus, made it sound like the case was so obvious even a child could see the guilt. Keisha's opening was different. She'd told the jury about Marcus's life. Community college student, working part-time at a warehouse to help his mother pay rent. No history of violence. The marijuana charge from 2 years ago was for a joint he'd shared with friends at a concert. He'd paid a fine and done community service. The prosecution wants you to see a criminal, Keisha had told the jury. I want you to see a teenager who was in the wrong place at the wrong time and now faces having his life destroyed based on a misidentification and circumstantial evidence. Judge Morrison had rolled his eyes visibly during her opening, made a show of checking his watch, yawned. The next 2 days were the prosecution's case. The store clerk testified that someone had come in with a gun, demanded money, and run out. But under Keisha's cross-examination, the clerk admitted he'd only seen the robber for about 90 seconds. The store was poorly lit. The robber wore a hoodie that obscured his face. The clerk was terrified and focused on the gun, not the person holding it. "So when you identified my client in the lineup," Keisha had asked, "you were choosing from 6 young black men of similar height and build, trying to remember a face you'd seen for 90 seconds in bad lighting while being threatened with a gun?" I'm pretty sure it was him." "Pretty sure? Or certain?" I recognized him. From the 90 seconds in bad lighting? Or from the photo the police showed you before the lineup?" The prosecutor had objected. Judge Morrison sustained it. "Counselor, the witness has identified the defendant. Move on." But the seed of doubt was planted. Keisha could see it in some jurors' faces. The police detective who'd investigated testified next. He'd shown the clerk 6 photos before the lineup. Marcus's photo was among them. The clerk had hesitated, then pointed to Marcus. "Maybe this one." The detective had then arranged a live lineup with Marcus and 5 fill-ins. The clerk had picked Marcus again. "That's him, I'm sure." But Keisha had gotten the detective to admit that all 6 men in the lineup were wearing similar clothes and had similar builds, that the lighting in the lineup room was much better than the store, that the clerk had already seen Marcus's photo before the lineup, a textbook example of suggestion and confirmation bias. The security footage was damning at first glance. It showed someone roughly Marcus's height and build entering the store at 9:47 p.m., showed them approaching the counter. Then the camera angle changed and you couldn't see the actual robbery, then showed the person running out at 9:51 p.m. But under Keisha's questioning, the detective had to admit the footage was grainy. The person's face was never clearly visible. The clothing, dark hoodie and jeans, was generic. The height estimate was based on comparison to store shelving, not exact measurement. "Detective, would you say that dark hoodie and jeans describe roughly 40% of young men in this neighborhood on any given night?" That's a common style of dress, yes." "So this footage shows a person of average height wearing common clothing. It doesn't definitively identify my client, does it?" Combined with the witness identification, "I asked about the footage alone, Detective. Does this video definitively show Marcus Johnson's face?" "No." Small victories. Keisha was building reasonable doubt brick by brick, but Judge Morrison kept interrupting her cross-examinations, sustaining prosecution objections that had no merit, rushing her through questioning, making faces that signaled to the jury he thought her questions were frivolous. "Counselor, we've already established the witness identified the defendant. How many more times do you need to ask the same question?" "Your Honor, I'm entitled to thorough cross-examination." "You're entitled to reasonable cross-examination, not to waste this court's time." The prosecution rested their case yesterday afternoon. The evidence was thin. Keisha knew it, and some of the jurors knew it too. But Judge Morrison's constant interference and visible bias were poisoning the well. This morning, Keisha had called her first defense witness, Marcus's mother, who testified that Marcus had been home that night, that he'd been studying for a test, that he hadn't left the house. The prosecutor had torn into her on cross. "Ms. Johnson, you love your son, don't you?" "Of course I do." "You'd do anything to keep him out of prison?" "I'm telling the truth. He was home. You'd lie for him if you thought it would help." "I'm not lying." But the damage was done. Jury members were skeptical. Of course a mother would protect her son. Keisha called Marcus's roommate from community college. He testified that Marcus had texted him from home that night, complaining about a boring textbook, time-stamped at 9:52 p.m. when the robber was running from the store. But the prosecutor pointed out that Marcus could have sent the text before or after the robbery, could have had someone else send it. The text didn't prove location. Now it was time for closing arguments. This was Keisha's last chance, the moment where she'd either save Marcus or watch him go to prison for a decade. She'd spent all last night preparing, hadn't slept, had consumed enough coffee to fuel a small army. She'd written and rewritten her closing argument 17 times, practiced it in her bathroom mirror, timed it to fit within the 30 minutes Judge Morrison had grudgingly allowed. This argument was the best work she'd ever done. She knew it. She could feel it. This was the argument that would free Marcus. But first, she had to endure Judge Morrison's contempt one more time. The morning had started badly. Keisha had arrived at court at 7:30 a.m. to review her notes one final time. She'd spilled coffee on her blouse, the white one she wore under her suit jacket, the only clean professional shirt she owned. She'd frantically tried to rinse it in the courthouse bathroom, but the stain wouldn't come out. She'd had to keep her jacket buttoned all day to hide the brown splotch. Then, entering the courtroom, she'd caught her heel on the doorframe. The cheap Target shoe's heel had snapped clean off. She'd limped to the defense table, trying to walk without the obvious height difference between her 2 feet being visible. She'd slipped the broken shoe off under the table, hoping no one would notice. Of course, Judge Morrison noticed. "Counselor, are you having trouble walking?" "No, Your Honor, I'm fine." "You look like you're limping. Are you injured?" "Just a broken shoe heel, Your Honor. It won't affect my ability to—" "A broken shoe." He'd said it loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear. Perhaps the Orleans Parish Public Defender's Office should invest in better footwear for their attorneys, though I suppose that would require them to win cases and earn the budget. Laughter from the gallery, from the prosecutors, even from a few jurors. Keisha had stood there, face burning, while the judge made jokes at her expense. That's when he'd made the comment about her cheap suit and thrift store shopping. Now, as the jury filed back in from lunch break, Keisha stood at the defense table with one shoe on and one shoe off under the table, wearing a stained blouse hidden under a 4-year-old suit, holding the closing argument that would change everything. Judge Morrison addressed the courtroom. "We'll now hear closing arguments. Mr. Mitchell, you may proceed." The prosecutor stood, buttoning his expensive suit jacket. He walked to the jury with confidence, a man who'd already won. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a simple case. The defendant walked into a store. He pointed a gun at the clerk. He stole money. He ran. The clerk identified him. The security footage shows someone matching his description. The evidence is clear." He paused dramatically. "The defense wants you to believe this is a case of mistaken identity, that the clerk who saw the robber's face somehow picked the wrong person, that the security footage, which clearly shows someone of the defendant's height and build, is somehow unreliable, that a mother who would obviously lie to protect her son is a credible witness." Mitchell walked along the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. "But you're smarter than that. You can see through the defense's smoke and mirrors. Marcus Johnson committed this robbery. The evidence proves it, and your duty is to find him guilty." He sat down. 20 minutes of confident, polished advocacy, the kind of closing argument that came from years of practice and victories. Now it was Keisha's turn. She stood, trying not to favor her unshod foot, walked to the jury box, looked at 12 faces that would decide Marcus's future. She'd spent hundreds of hours on this case, interviewed witnesses the police hadn't bothered with, found security footage from a gas station 3 blocks away that showed someone matching the robber's description, but it wasn't Marcus. Tracked down Marcus's phone records showing his location. Data put him at home during the robbery. Judge Morrison had suppressed most of that evidence on technicalities. The gas station footage was too far from the scene to be relevant. The phone location data was not sufficiently precise. The alibi witnesses were biased. But Keisha had one more weapon, the truth, and the ability to make a jury see it. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began. 3 weeks ago, I was assigned to represent Marcus Johnson. I inherited this case from another public defender who quit because our office is underfunded and overworked. I had 3 weeks to prepare for a trial the prosecution has been building for 6 months. She paused, letting that sink in. "The prosecutor just told you this is a simple case. He's right, but not for the reasons he thinks." Keisha walked to where Marcus sat, put her hand on his shoulder. "This is simple because it's a story that happens every single day in this city. A young black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. A witness under stress who makes a misidentification. Police who take the easy route instead of thorough investigation. And prosecutors who care more about their conviction rate than actual justice." "Objection!" The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Your Honor, counsel is making inappropriate accusations." "Overruled." Judge Morrison said, but his tone was warning. "Counselor, stick to the evidence. No speeches about systemic injustice." Keisha nodded. "Let's talk about the evidence then." The witness, the store clerk, saw the robber for approximately 90 seconds. The lighting was poor. He was terrified. He was focused on the gun, not the face. Then the police showed him a photo array. He hesitated, said, "Maybe this one," while pointing to Marcus's picture. She walked back to the jury. "Let me ask you something. If you saw someone's face for 90 seconds in bad lighting while being threatened, would you remember every detail? Would you be certain enough to send them to prison for 10 to 20 years? A few jurors shifted uncomfortably. The clerk testified under oath that he recognized Marcus. But what did he recognize? The face from the robbery or the face from the photo the detective showed him? Because those are two very different things. That's called suggestion, and it's one of the leading causes of wrongful convictions. Keisha picked up an exhibit, the security footage still images. The prosecution wants you to believe this grainy footage shows Marcus. Let's examine that claim. Can you see the person's face clearly in any of these images? She held them up one by one. The jury leaned forward, squinting. No, you can't, because the person's face is never clearly visible. You can see a hoodie, jeans, average height. That describes thousands of young men in this city on any given night. She put the images down. So if the footage doesn't show a clear face and the witness identification is questionable at best, what evidence actually proves Marcus committed this crime? Silence. The prosecutor will tell you that Marcus has a criminal record. Possession of marijuana. 2 years ago. He paid a fine, did community service, learned his lesson. But now the prosecution wants you to believe that because Marcus once shared a joint with friends, he must be an armed robber. That's not logic. That's prejudice. Judge Morrison cleared his throat, loudly. A warning. Keisha ignored it. Marcus's mother testified he was home that night. You heard the prosecutor attack her, suggest she'd lie for her son. Maybe she would. But ask yourselves, does that make her testimony false? Or does love for her child make her testimony more reliable, not less? She walked to the defense table, picked up her notes. I had evidence that would prove Marcus's innocence. Security footage from a gas station showing the real robber. Different facial features, different build. Phone records showing Marcus's location at home during the robbery. Witnesses who saw someone matching the description running a different direction than Marcus's house. Objection! The prosecutor stood again. Your Honor, this evidence was ruled inadmissible. Counsel cannot reference suppressed. Sustained, Judge Morrison said sharply. Counselor, another word about suppressed evidence and I'll hold you in contempt. Keisha looked at the judge, really looked at him, saw the contempt in his eyes, the certainty that she was wasting everyone's time, and something in her snapped, not anger, something colder, something more dangerous. The decision she'd been avoiding for 3 weeks, the choice she'd hoped she wouldn't have to make. She'd been collecting evidence against Judge Morrison for 2 years. Not for this case, for something bigger. She'd noticed patterns in his rulings, disparities in sentencing, black defendants getting harsher punishments than white defendants for identical crimes, evidence being suppressed in cases where defendants were poor, favorable rulings for defendants whose families could afford to donate to his re-election campaigns. She'd documented everything, built a file, shared it with the State Ethics Commission, the FBI, investigative journalists, waited for someone to act. No one had. Judge Morrison was too connected, too careful, too powerful. But Keisha had one more piece of evidence. The smoking gun, audio recordings that proved Judge Morrison was coordinating with prosecutors to rig trials, accepting bribes from wealthy defendants' families to reduce sentences, deliberately suppressing exculpatory evidence to ensure convictions. She'd obtained the recordings legally. They'd been accidentally included in discovery materials from another case. A prosecutor's phone had recorded a conversation with the judge without either of them realizing it. The file had been mislabeled and sent to public defenders by mistake. Keisha had been holding on to this evidence, waiting for the right moment. She'd planned to release it carefully, through proper channels, ensuring it would lead to disbarment and criminal charges. But proper channels had failed, and Marcus was about to go to prison for a crime he didn't commit because this corrupt judge had suppressed all the exculpatory evidence. Keisha made her choice. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "I'd like to make a proffer for the record regarding the court's repeated suppression of evidence and possible bias in this case." Judge Morrison's face darkened. "Counselor, I'm warning you. The jury deserves to know why crucial evidence has been kept from them. They deserve to understand that this court's rulings have been—" "That's enough!" the judge's voice boomed. "Bailiff, remove counsel from my courtroom. She's in contempt." The bailiff hesitated, looking uncertain. Keisha spoke quickly before she could be stopped. "Your Honor, I have audio recordings of conversations between you and the prosecutor in this case. Conversations where you coordinated which evidence to suppress, where you discussed ensuring convictions regardless of actual guilt, where you—" The courtroom exploded. The prosecutor shouted objections. Judge Morrison pounded his gavel. Jury members gasped. Reporters pulled out phones. "You're making false accusations." Judge Morrison's face was bright red. "Bailiff, remove her now and arrest her for contempt of court." But Keisha pulled out her phone, connected it to the courtroom's speaker system. She'd prepared for this possibility. Pressed play. Judge Morrison's voice filled the courtroom. "Steve, we need to make sure that Johnson kid gets convicted. Can't have another not guilty in an election year. What evidence does the public defender have?" The prosecutor's voice. "She's got phone records that put him at home during the robbery. Gas station footage showing someone else, pretty strong alibi." Judge Morrison. "Suppress it all. Find technicalities. The phone records aren't precise enough. The gas station is too far. The alibi witnesses are biased. Whatever it takes." Prosecutor. "What if she objects?" Judge Morrison. Laughing. "She's a public defender in a cheap suit. Who's going to believe her over me?" The courtroom fell silent. 200 people listening to a judge and prosecutor conspiring to convict an innocent man. Keisha let the recording play for another 90 seconds. More evidence. More corruption. Discussions of other cases. Other defendants whose evidence had been suppressed. A pattern of misconduct spanning years. Then she stopped the recording and looked directly at Judge Morrison. "Your Honor, that conversation happened 6 days ago, while I was still preparing for this trial, while you were ruling on my motions to admit evidence. Evidence you suppressed not because it was inadmissible, but because it would prove my client's innocence." Judge Morrison stood, his face a mixture of rage and terror. "Those recordings are illegal, inadmissible. They were included in discovery. Materials by accident, completely legal. And I have copies with the FBI, the State Ethics Commission, and 3 different journalists. So even if you try to suppress this evidence too, it's already public." She turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard a judge and prosecutor conspiring to convict an innocent man, to suppress evidence, to rig a trial, not because Marcus Johnson is guilty, but because in an election year, Judge Morrison can't afford another not guilty verdict." The prosecutor was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. She's trying to—" "I'm trying to prevent a miscarriage of justice," Keisha cut him off, "which is my duty as a defense attorney, even when the court itself is corrupt." She walked back to the jury box. "You heard the evidence the prosecution presented. A questionable witness identification, grainy security footage, circumstantial evidence. Now you know why you didn't hear the evidence that proves Marcus's innocence, because this judge deliberately suppressed it." Her voice got stronger. "I stand here in a cheap suit because I make $42,000 a year representing people who can't afford lawyers. I work 80-hour weeks because my office is so underfunded that each attorney carries over 100 cases. I wear shoes from Target that break because I spend my money on rent and student loans, not designer clothes." She looked at Judge Morrison. "But my cheap suit doesn't mean I'm a cheap lawyer, and my broken shoes don't mean I don't know the law. In fact, I know it better than the judge sitting on that bench who's been violating it for 23 years. The courtroom was absolutely silent, except for the sound of reporters typing frantically. Keisha turned back to the jury. "You have a decision to make. You can follow the judge's instructions and convict an innocent man, Or you can do what the judge and prosecutor refused to do, deliver actual justice. Marcus Johnson did not commit this robbery. The evidence proves it. The only question is whether you'll let corruption determine the verdict, or whether you'll do the right thing. She walked back to the defense table, sat down beside Marcus, who was staring at her with tears streaming down his face. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it," Keisha said. "I'm asking you to consider what you heard on that recording. Ask yourselves why a judge would suppress evidence if he thought the defendant was actually guilty. Ask why a prosecutor would coordinate with a judge to ensure a conviction instead of seeking truth. Then look at the actual evidence, the questionable identification, the grainy footage, the circumstantial case, and ask whether that's enough to send a teenager to prison for 10 to 20 years. She stood one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, I know I don't look like what you expect a good lawyer to look like. I'm young, I'm black, I'm a woman. I wear cheap suits and broken shoes. I make poverty wages defending people's society, has already written off. But I went to Yale Law School, graduated near the top of my class, turned down jobs paying $190,000 a year to work here, in this courtroom, defending people like Marcus who deserve justice but can't afford it." Her voice filled the courtroom. "So when Judge Morrison mocks my cheap suit, he's really mocking everyone who can't afford expensive lawyers. When he rushes my cross-examination, he's denying poor defendants the same rights rich defendants get automatically. When he suppresses evidence, he's rigging the system to ensure that being poor means being presumed guilty. I'm done being mocked for caring more about justice than money. I'm done watching judges and prosecutors treat trials like games where the defendant loses because they can't afford to play. And I'm done staying silent while corruption destroys innocent lives." Keisha picked up her notes. "The law says Marcus Johnson is presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, not proven guilty beyond a questionable identification, not proven guilty beyond grainy footage, beyond a reasonable doubt. Ask yourselves if you have doubt, because after hearing a judge conspire to suppress evidence, if you don't have doubt, then we've lost more than just this case. We've lost the meaning of justice itself." She sat down. The courtroom remained silent. Judge Morrison's face had gone from red to white. His hands shook as he gripped the bench. "This court is in recess," he said hoarsely. "Bailiff, confiscate that recording device. I'm holding counsel in contempt of court and—" "Your Honor," one of the journalists called out, "that recording has already been sent to our newsroom. It's broadcasting live in 3 minutes. Confiscating the phone won't stop anything." Judge Morrison looked out at the courtroom, saw the phone's recording, saw his career ending in real time, saw 23 years of corruption about to be exposed. "This court is adjourned," he said weakly, then fled the bench toward his chambers. He never made it. FBI agents entered the courtroom. "Judge Richard Morrison, you're under arrest for corruption, bribery, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent." The second golden beat had landed. The moment when the dismissed expert doesn't just prove their competence, they destroy the system that tried to dismiss them. The courtroom descended into chaos, reporters swarming, FBI agents leading Judge Morrison out in handcuffs, the prosecutor trying to leave before he got arrested too. And in the middle of it all, Marcus turned to Keisha with tears streaming down his face. "You just destroyed your career for me," he said. "They're going to come after you for this." Keisha smiled. "They can try, but I have something they don't." "What?" "The truth, and a really good closing argument." 3 hours later, after the judge had been arrested and a new judge assigned, the jury deliberated for 45 minutes. Verdict: not guilty on all counts. Marcus walked out of that courtroom a free man, and Keisha walked out as the lawyer who'd just blown up the entire corrupt system. The aftermath was immediate and explosive. Judge Morrison was formally arrested and charged with 47 counts of corruption, bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The FBI had been building a case against him for months, but lacked the final piece of evidence needed for charges. Keisha's recording provided it. The prosecutor, Stephen Mitchell, was suspended pending investigation. Turned out he'd been coordinating with Judge Morrison on dozens of cases over the past 5 years. He eventually took a plea deal, disbarment, and 3 years in prison in exchange for testimony against the judge. But the revelations didn't stop there. As journalists dug into Judge Morrison's history, they found a pattern spanning his entire career. Hundreds of cases where evidence had been suspiciously suppressed. Disparities in sentencing that couldn't be explained by case facts alone. A clear pattern of harsher treatment for poor defendants, particularly defendants of color. The Orleans Parish Public Defender's Office filed motions to reopen 284 cases that had been tried in Judge Morrison's courtroom over the past decade. Cases where potentially innocent people had been convicted based on suppressed evidence and rigged proceedings. Marcus Johnson became the first, but there would be many more. Within a week, 17 defendants had their convictions overturned. Within a month, 43. By the end of the year, over 100 people had been released from prison, people who'd been convicted in Morrison's courtroom under questionable circumstances. The media coverage was relentless. Public Defender's 42K closing argument exposes multi-million-dollar corruption scheme. Lawyer in cheap suit takes down federal judge. Yale law grad chose public defense over corporate money, then destroyed judicial corruption. Keisha gave interviews to everyone who asked. Network news, podcasts, legal journals. She told the same story over and over. This wasn't about one corrupt judge. This was about a system that underfunded public defense, overworked attorneys, and presumed poor defendants guilty. "I'm not a hero," she told one reporter. "I'm just a public defender who refused to accept that justice should depend on how much money you have. The real heroes are the clients who trusted me despite having every reason not to trust the system." But there were consequences for Keisha, too. The Louisiana State Bar filed an ethics complaint against her. Not for the recordings, those were legal, but for the manner in which she'd presented them, for grandstanding in court, for making political speeches during closing arguments, for bringing the legal profession into disrepute. The complaint was transparently retaliatory. Everyone knew it. But it still meant Keisha had to defend her law license. She hired a lawyer, her former professor from Yale, who represented her pro bono. The hearing was set for 3 months after the trial. In the meantime, job offers flooded in. Major law firms wanted her. "Come work for us, $250,000 starting salary. Corporate legal departments, nonprofit organizations. Lead our criminal justice reform initiative, $180,000 plus full benefits." Even the Orleans Parish Public Defender's Office offered her a promotion. Chief Public Defender, you'd oversee the entire office, $95,000 and you can set your own policies. Keisha turned them all down. "I'm a trial lawyer," she told her boss. "I defend people in courtrooms. That's the job. I don't want to manage budgets or give speeches at fundraisers. I want to stand next to people who can't afford lawyers and fight for them." Her boss stared at her. "You just became the most famous public defender in America. You could write your own ticket, make real money, pay off your loans, live somewhere without cockroaches." "I like my apartment," Keisha lied. "And I like my job. I'm staying." But staying meant facing the ethics hearing. 3 months after Marcus's acquittal, Keisha sat in a conference room at the Louisiana State Bar headquarters. 5 attorneys on the disciplinary panel. Her former professor beside her. A court reporter documenting everything. The bar's prosecutor, a man in his 60s wearing a suit that cost more than Keisha made in 2 months, presented the complaint. Ms. Williams engaged in theatrical grandstanding during a closing argument. She made political speeches about systemic injustice instead of focusing on the facts of her case. She ambushed a sitting judge with recordings in open court, creating a circus atmosphere. While we acknowledge that Judge Morrison's conduct was reprehensible, that doesn't excuse Ms. Williams's unprofessional behavior. He presented witness testimony. Other judges who said Keisha's tactics had poisoned the legal community. Prosecutors who claimed she'd weaponized her closing argument. Legal ethics experts who opined that there were proper channels for reporting judicial misconduct that didn't involve dramatic revelations in front of a jury. Ms. Williams had options, the bar's prosecutor argued. She could have filed a motion for recusal, could have reported the recordings to the Ethics Commission quietly, could have requested a mistrial. Instead, she chose spectacle over procedure. That's not advocacy, it's showmanship, and it has no place in our legal system. He sat down, confident he'd made his case. Keisha's professor stood. May I call Ms. Williams to testify? Proceed. Keisha took the stand, swore to tell the truth. Her professor asked her to walk through the case. Every detail, every suppressed piece of evidence, every ruling that had no legal basis, every sign that the fix was in. Ms. Williams, why didn't you file a motion for recusal when you suspected Judge Morrison was biased? I did, sir. 3 times during pre-trial proceedings. All denied. Why didn't you report the recordings to the Ethics Commission quietly? I had already reported Judge Morrison to the Ethics Commission 2 years ago. Filed a comprehensive complaint with evidence of bias in 17 other cases. They investigated and found insufficient evidence of misconduct. Reporting him again through quiet channels would have resulted in the same nothing while Marcus went to prison. Why didn't you request a mistrial? On what grounds? Judicial bias? Judge Morrison would have denied it, just like he denied my 3 recusal motions, and even if he'd granted it, the next judge assigned would have been from the same courthouse, part of the same system, with the same incentives to protect a colleague. Keisha leaned forward. I had an innocent client facing 20 years in prison because a corrupt judge had suppressed all exculpatory evidence. I had proof of that corruption, and I had a jury of 12 citizens who deserved to know why they weren't hearing the full truth. I could follow proper channels that had already failed, or I could do my job, which is to defend my client by any legal means necessary. So you maintain that playing the recordings in open court was the right decision? I maintain that it was the only decision that would actually protect my client's rights. Proper channels are wonderful when they work, but when the system itself is corrupt, proper channels just perpetuate corruption. Her professor nodded. No further questions. The bar's prosecutor stood for cross-examination. Ms. Williams, are you aware that your actions have made it more difficult for other public defenders to practice in Orleans Parish? That judges are now hostile to defense attorneys because of the publicity you generated? I'm aware that exposing corruption sometimes makes corrupt people angry. I'm also aware that 17 people are free right now who would still be in prison if I'd stayed quiet. I'll take judicial hostility over innocent people in cages. You don't think you grandstanded? Used your closing argument as a platform for political speech? I think I gave the best closing argument I could to save my client. If explaining why evidence was suppressed is political, then the law itself is political. You could have been more tactful, more respectful of the court. Keisha looked directly at the disciplinary panel. Respectfully, my client's freedom was more important than Judge Morrison's feelings. I'm a defense attorney. My duty is to my client, not to protecting the reputation of corrupt judges. The cross-examination continued for 2 hours. Every angle of attack, every suggestion that Keisha had crossed ethical lines. She held firm on every point. Finally, the panel deliberated. Keisha waited in the hallway with her professor, drinking terrible coffee from a vending machine. How do you think it went? She asked. You were brilliant. But panels like this are conservative. They value decorum and procedure. You violated both, even if for good reasons. So I'm getting disbarred for doing my job? I don't think so. But there will probably be some kind of sanction. A reprimand. Maybe a short suspension. They have to do something to save face. 90 minutes later, they were called back in. The panel chair, a woman in her 70s with steel-gray hair, read the decision. The panel has carefully considered the evidence presented regarding Ms. Williams's conduct during the trial of State v. Johnson. We acknowledge that Ms. Williams's methods were unorthodox and that her closing argument included elements that could be considered political commentary rather than pure legal advocacy. Keisha's stomach dropped. Here it comes. However, the chair continued, we also find that Ms. Williams was operating under extraordinary circumstances. She had evidence of active judicial corruption that directly impacted her client's case. She had attempted to use proper channels for reporting this corruption, which had failed, and she was facing a situation where an innocent client would almost certainly be convicted if she did not take dramatic action. The chair looked directly at Keisha. Miss Williams, this panel does not condone theatrical tactics in courtroom settings. We do not encourage defense attorneys to use closing arguments as platforms for systemic critiques of the justice system. Under normal circumstances, your conduct would warrant significant sanctions. She paused. But these were not normal circumstances. You were facing active corruption. You used legal means, properly obtained recordings, to expose that corruption. And most importantly, your actions freed an innocent man and led to the release of over 100 other potentially innocent defendants. Therefore, this panel finds that while your methods were questionable, your underlying conduct was consistent with your ethical duties as a defense attorney. We issue a formal reprimand for the theatrical nature of your presentation, but no suspension or other sanction. Your law license remains active without restriction. Keisha felt tears forming. Thank you. Don't thank us yet. The chair's voice got stern. This is a one-time finding based on extraordinary circumstances. Do not interpret this as permission to regularly grandstand in courtrooms. If you appear before this panel again for similar conduct, the outcome will be very different. Understood? Yes, ma'am. Understood. Good. This hearing is adjourned. Keisha walked out of the hearing room into a crowd of reporters, cameras, microphones. Questions shouted from every direction. Ms. Williams, how do you feel about keeping your license? Grateful and ready to get back to work. Will you change your approach to trials after this? I'll always do whatever is necessary to defend my clients, within legal boundaries, just like I did in Marcus's case. What's next for you? I have 87 active cases. Waiting. People who need lawyers. That's what's next. She pushed through the crowd, got to her beat-up Honda Civic in the parking lot, and drove back to the public defender's office. Her colleagues greeted her with cheers and applause. Someone had hung a banner. "Welcome back, counselor." Her boss pulled her aside. "You know you're now the most requested public defender in the city, right? We've had 300 people specifically ask for you to represent them." "I can't take 300 cases." "I know, but it's a problem we've never had before. Too many people wanting public defenders instead of trying to scrape together money for private counsel." Keisha smiled. "Maybe that means they're starting to trust us again. Maybe it means they trust you. Which brings me to my next point. I know I offered you chief public defender before. You turned it down. But I'm asking again, not to manage budgets, to rebuild this office into what it should be. You've got national attention, funding offers, political support. We could actually make real changes." Keisha thought about it. About all the public defenders drowning under impossible caseloads. About the systemic issues that made what happened to Marcus possible in the first place. What kind of changes are we talking about? Reasonable caseloads, actual investigation budgets, training programs, proper salaries so we stop losing good attorneys to private practice. Everything you've been fighting for, but at the systemic level instead of case by case. And I'd still get to take cases? Try trials? You'd have to do some administrative work. But yes, you could still be in courtrooms, still defend people, just also shape how the entire office operates. Keisha looked around the cramped, underfunded office, at her colleagues who worked too hard for too little because they believed in the work, at the clients in the waiting room who deserved better representation than the system usually gave them. "Okay," she said, "I'll do it, but on one condition." "What's that?" "We start a pipeline program. Partner with local colleges and law schools. Find brilliant students from poor neighborhoods who want to be public defenders. Give them internships, mentorships, scholarships. Build the next generation of advocates who understand what it means to defend people who look like their families and come from their communities." Her boss smiled. "That's why you're the right person for this job. When do you start?" "After I finish my current 87 cases. I'm not abandoning my clients." "Fair enough. But in the meantime, you should know. The governor wants to meet with you, talking about criminal justice reform legislation, using what you exposed about Morrison to push for systemic changes statewide." "The governor? Really? You're the most famous lawyer in Louisiana right now. Probably the most famous public defender in America. People are listening. Use it." 6 months later, the transformation was undeniable. Keisha stood in front of the Louisiana State Legislature as they voted on the Public Defense Reform Act, legislation that would increase funding for public defender offices by 400%, mandate maximum caseloads, no attorney could handle more than 60 active cases, require investigation budgets, establish salary minimums that would make public defense competitive with entry-level prosecutor positions. The bill passed 31-7 in the Senate, 84-19 in the House. Keisha watched from the gallery as the governor signed it into law, using 17 different pens so he could give commemorative pens to everyone who'd fought for the bill. He handed her the first pen. "This wouldn't exist without you, Ms. Williams. You showed the country what happens when we underfund justice, made it impossible to ignore." That same week, Marcus Johnson enrolled at Louisiana State University, full scholarship, pre-law program. He wanted to become a public defender. "You saved my life," he told Keisha over coffee. "Literally. I was going to prison for 20 years for something I didn't do. Now I'm going to college. I want to do what you do. Help people the system gave up on." "It's hard work," Keisha warned. "Terrible pay, long hours. You'll see the worst of the system every single day." "I know. That's why it matters." Keisha smiled. "Then you'll be a great public defender." Judge Richard Morrison was convicted on 43 counts of corruption, sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. He'd serve every day of it, no parole, no early release. He'd betrayed the bench, and the sentence reflected that. The prosecutor, Stephen Mitchell, served his 3 years and was released, disbarred for life. Last Keisha heard, he was working as a consultant for a private investigation firm, making more money than he had as a prosecutor, ironically. But the real victory wasn't their punishment. It was the 147 people who'd been released from prison. Cases reopened and overturned. Innocent people who'd lost years of their lives to a corrupt system finally getting justice. Keisha met with as many of them as she could, heard their stories, helped them connect with resources for re-entry. Several became advocates themselves, speaking about wrongful convictions and the need for reform. The Orleans Parish Public Defender's Office was transformed. Funding increased. Caseloads decreased. Salaries went up to $65,000 for starting attorneys. Still not corporate money, but livable. Applications flooded in. For the first time in years, they could be selective about hiring instead of taking anyone willing to work for poverty wages. Keisha's pipeline program launched with 15 students from local communities. They worked in the office during summers, got mentorship from experienced public defenders, received scholarship money for college and law school. The goal was to build a generation of advocates who understood the communities they served. 2 years after Marcus's trial, Keisha gave the keynote address at Yale Law School's graduation. She stood at the podium in the same navy suit she'd worn that day in court. She'd kept it intentionally, had it repaired and cleaned, but refused to replace it. It was a reminder. "When I graduated from this school 7 years ago," she began, "I turned down job offers that would have paid me $190,000 a year. My classmates thought I was crazy. Maybe I was. I went to work as a public defender making $42,000, wore cheap suits, broke the heels off Target shoes, lived in a studio apartment with cockroaches." She paused, looking out at 300 graduating law students in their robes. "But I also defended 187 people who couldn't afford lawyers, won freedom for 96 of them, got reduced charges for 67 others, and in one case, I exposed judicial corruption that freed 147 innocent people and changed the entire public defense system in Louisiana. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you because you're about to make choices. Choices about what kind of lawyer you'll be, what you'll value, what you'll fight for. Some of you will take corporate jobs, make $200,000 or more, work for wealthy clients on mergers and acquisitions. There's nothing wrong with that. Corporate law needs good attorneys, and you'll be able to pay off your loans and live comfortably. But some of you should consider another path: public defense, civil rights work, immigration law, veterans advocacy, the areas of law where your clients can't pay you much but need you desperately. Because here's what I learned wearing my cheap suit in that courtroom. Justice shouldn't depend on how much money you have, The quality of your lawyer shouldn't be determined by the size of your bank account, and the system only changes when brilliant people choose to work in it, even when it doesn't pay well. She looked directly at the students. I stood in front of a jury in a 4-year-old suit with a broken shoe and a coffee stain on my blouse. A judge mocked me, called me unqualified, suggested I was wasting everyone's time. Then I gave the closing argument that freed an innocent man, exposed a corrupt judge, and reformed an entire state's public defense system. Not because of my suit, because of my training, my dedication, and my refusal to accept that poor people deserved less justice than rich people. So when you choose your first job, don't just think about salary. Think about impact. Think about who needs you most. Think about the difference between having a career and having a calling. Some of the best lawyers in this country make $50,000 a year defending people nobody else will defend. They wear cheap suits and broken shoes. They work 80-hour weeks. They lose more cases than they win because the system is rigged against their clients. But they show up every single day. They fight anyway. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, they win. And when they win, they don't just save one person. They change the system that was trying to destroy that person. Keisha's voice got stronger. That's the work that matters. Not the work that pays the most. The work that changes lives. The work that makes justice accessible to everyone. Not just people who can afford $500-an-hour lawyers. So yes, take the corporate job if that's your path. But some of you, the brilliant ones, the dedicated ones, the ones who came to law school to make a difference, I'm asking you to consider public defense. Consider civil rights law. Consider the paths that pay less but matter more. Because the lawyer in the cheap suit might be the best lawyer in the courtroom. The public defender with the impossible caseload might be the only thing standing between an innocent person and a 20-year prison sentence. The advocate who makes $45,000 a year might change more lives than the partner making $2 million. Don't judge a lawyer by their suit. Judge them by their work, by their dedication, by their willingness to fight for justice even when the system makes it nearly impossible. She smiled. And if you do choose public defense, know this. You'll be underpaid, overworked, mocked by judges and dismissed by prosecutors. You'll wear cheap suits and broken shoes. You'll lose cases that should have been wins. You'll see the worst of the system every single day. But you'll also save innocent lives, free people who deserved freedom, fight battles that matter, and occasionally, rarely but beautifully, you'll win so decisively that you change not just one case, but the entire system. That's the work I do. That's the work that needs brilliant lawyers like you, and that's the work that makes law school worth it. Not the salary, but the impact. She stepped back from the podium. Congratulations, graduates. Now go change the world, with or without expensive suits. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes. After the speech, 32 students approached Keisha, all interested in public defense, all inspired by her story, all willing to consider careers that paid less but mattered more. 3 of them eventually joined the Orleans Parish Public Defender's Office. One became Keisha's protege, a brilliant young woman from the 9th Ward who'd grown up watching the justice system destroy her community. She'd gone to college on scholarship, law school on loans, and chose public defense despite offers from corporate firms. You showed me it was possible, she told Keisha, to be excellent and poor, to be brilliant and underpaid, to choose impact over income. It's not easy, Keisha warned. Nothing worth doing is. 5 years after Marcus's trial, Keisha had reformed not just Orleans Parish, but inspired changes across the country. 15 states had passed public defense reform legislation modeled on Louisiana's law. Federal funding for public defense had increased. Law schools were adding public defense clinics to their curriculums. And most importantly, conviction rates for poor defendants were dropping, not because they were getting off on technicalities, but because they were finally getting competent representation. Lawyers who had time to investigate cases, resources to hire experts, workloads that allowed them to actually prepare for trial. The system was still broken in many ways. Still biased, still unfair to poor people and people of color. But it was better than it had been. And it kept getting better because people like Keisha kept fighting. Marcus Johnson graduated from LSU and enrolled in law school at Tulane. He'd made the dean's list every semester, won a scholarship for academic excellence, was being recruited by top firms, but he'd already made his choice. Public defender, just like Keisha. I want to be the lawyer I needed, he told her. The one who fights even when everyone says it's hopeless. The one who sees their clients as people, not case numbers. The one who wears cheap suits and broken shoes because they're spending their energy on the work, not the wardrobe. Keisha hugged him. You're going to be amazing. I learned from the best. The final truth that mattered was simpler than any legal argument. Excellence doesn't require expensive suits. Justice doesn't depend on designer shoes. And the best lawyers aren't always the highest paid. They're the ones who show up every day to fight for people who can't fight for themselves. Keisha proved that in a courtroom in New Orleans, and she kept proving it every single day after. Have you ever been judged by your appearance instead of your abilities? Have you ever been dismissed because you couldn't afford what others took for granted? Have you ever watched someone assume you were incompetent based on how you looked? Share your story in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of dismissed experts, hidden brilliance, and the moments when excellence destroys assumptions. Because somewhere right now, a brilliant lawyer is wearing a cheap suit, a dedicated advocate is working for poverty wages, an excellent attorney is being mocked for not looking the part. Make sure you're not the one doing the mocking. Remember, the lawyer in the cheap suit might be the best lawyer in the room. The public defender you dismiss might be a Yale law graduate who chose impact over income. The person you underestimate based on appearance might be exactly the person who changes everything. Keisha proved that, and her story is just beginning.